Hi kids, this is chapter 11 of Pride and Prejudice. Please excuse my hair and my Ninja Turtle thing up here. But anyway, we got to keep going. This is me on vacation mode. Anyway, so hopefully you've already started listening to the chapters on my YouTube channel. It's just for you guys. So don't go, I guess you can share if you want. But anyway, so this is me commenting, and sometimes I stop at the places where there are quiz questions. The quiz questions are not going to show up until January 6th. That's how the district set up our course to begin on the 6th. So that's when they're going to be available. But keep reading. Don't wait for me. And if you get ahead, perfect. Don't wait for me to post chapters. You really should keep reading without me. All right, but this is for people who are having a little bit of trouble understanding what's going on, or even if you just want to read along because it's something you like to do. Anyway, this is chapter 11. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well guarded from the cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her two friends with many professions of pleasure. And Elizabeth, excuse me, and Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentleman appeared. So they were, the ladies, they're talking about the Bingley sisters, that they were super nice and everything until the guys got there. Says their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humor, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. But when the gentleman entered, Jane was no longer the first object. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and she had something to say to him before he had advanced many steps. Oh my gosh, how annoying. I think Miss Bingley is just, I don't know, she's trying to get Darcy's attention, and she's just doing it in the wrong way, where she's just annoying now. Anyway, he addressed himself directly to Miss Bennet, Jane, with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow and said he was very glad, but diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room, and she moved at his desire to the other side of the fireplace, that she might be further from the door. He then sat down by her and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. So everybody's congratulating Jane that, she's doing better. They're glad she's well. But, it was Bingley who really was glad and paid more attention to her than anybody else. Anyway, when tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card table, but in vain. We know that's all Mr. Hurst is doing. He just wants to play cards, the end. I don't know anything else about, I don't know why he's even in the story. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason. We'll talk about that later. But it's like he's useless. He just plays cards and sleeps. That's it. Anyway, she had obtained private intelligence. I'm talking about Miss Bingley. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. So Jane Austen got rid of Mr. Hurst in this scene by putting him to sleep. Crazy. Darcy took up a book. Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. So Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." So Miss Bingley's being annoying. Darcy's trying to read a book. and she's just looking over his shoulder. She's talking to him. That really is a pain in the butt. I mean, maybe it's comparable to how I stop and make comments about, the story, but I'm hoping that it helps you out. Anyway, so I'm sure Darcy's annoyed. And then she chose her book because it was the second volume of his. Okay. No one made any reply. Nobody listened to her. They're ignoring her. Then she yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes around the room in quest of some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, to Jane, she turned suddenly toward him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine on it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins, but as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing, and as soon as Nichols has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried on in a different manner, but there is something insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing made the order of the day." So that's Miss Bennet saying that line. If you watch the movie, Miss Bennet doesn't say it, it's Mary. So be careful, because in the book, it's Miss Bennet. All right? I'm not sorry, not Miss Bennet, Miss Bingley. It's Miss Bingley. So she's saying it's better to have conversation than it is to have dancing, okay, at a ball. So this is what her brother, Charles Bingley, says. "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say, but it would not be near so much like a ball." Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, and turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." So Miss Bingley was not doing a good job getting Darcy's attention, and so she tried one last desperate thing, and she asked Elizabeth to walk with her. She knows, right? So Elizabeth was surprised, but it agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. So they asked him to walk around the room together. It must be a really big room. He's like, "Nah, you must be up to something, and you only have two motives. There could only be two reasons why you're walking around." He's like, "And I would get in the way if for either one." And she says, "What could he mean?" She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. She's like, "Elizabeth, what is he talking about?" And so she says, "Not at all," was her answer, "but depend on it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." She's like, "Ignore him, ignore him." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered, therefore, in requiring an explanation on his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you're conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" So he said, "Y'all are either telling secrets, and I'm going to be in the way, or you're walking for exercise so you can, work on your figures." He's like, "Well, then, if that's the case, then I can just watch you from here." And she's like, "Oh," she's all shocked about that. But I'm sure that's what she wanted. Anyway, so she says, how shall we punish him for such a speech?" Nothing so easy if you have but the inclination, said Elizabeth. We can all plague and punish one another, tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are, you must know how it is to be done. She's like, well, you tell me. You know him better than I do. How should we punish him? Should we laugh at him? And Caroline says, but upon my honor, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease, calmness of temper, and presence of mind? No. I feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself. So Caroline Bingley's like, well, there's nothing to laugh at him about. And Elizabeth says, Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at, cried Elizabeth. That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintance. I dearly love to laugh. Miss Bingley, said he, has given me credit for more than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke. Certainly, replied Elizabeth, there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can, but these, I suppose, are precisely what you're without. So if you notice here, Darcy and Elizabeth are talking with each other, and it's just them two. Like, Caroline is already out of the conversation, and they're talking about, about laughing at certain qualities in a person, and Darcy's like, well, I hope I don't have some of those qualities. She's like, well, what about these? Anyway, but she's saying, well, I guess you're without the qualities that people laugh at. And perhaps it is not possible for anyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule, such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation. Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. Your exclamation of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, said Miss Bingley, and pray, what is the result? So she's like, so what did you find out? Like, what do we do to punish him for what he said? I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise. No, said Darcy, I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. He's like, no, I'm not saying I'm perfect. But I just hope that, my faults, that people don't know what they are. My temper, I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others as soon as I ought, nor their offenses against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move them. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. So Darcy started listing all the things that, or all of his faults. That is a failing indeed, cried Elizabeth. Implacable resentment is a shade in a character, but you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody, and yours, he replied with a smile, is willfully to misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, you will not mind my waking Mr. Hurst? Her sister made not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy, after a few moments' recollection, was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Okay, this is chapter 12. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to her mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated her daughter's remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was not propitious, at least not to Elizabeth's wishes, for she was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, and in her postscript was added that if Miss Mr. Bingley and his sister pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them very well. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth was positively resolved, nor did she much expect it would be asked, and fearful, on the contrary, as being considered as intruding themselves needlessly long, she urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned and the request made. So Elizabeth's like, yeah, no, we are not staying here any longer. Jane is better, and their mother will not send the carriage. She's like, Jane, you need to ask Mr. Bingley for the carriage, for crying out loud. Anyway, the communication excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to work on Jane, and till the morrow their going was deferred, so they're staying another day. Just one. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection for the other. The master of the house heard with real sorrow that they were to go so soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not enough recovered, but Jane was firm where she felt herself to be right. So Mr. Bingley also tried to have her stay a little bit longer, but Jane was like, yeah, no, I am done. I mean, there is such a thing as overstaying your welcome, you know. So anyway, to Mr. Darcy, it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her, and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him, nothing that could elevate her, with the hope of influencing his felicity, sensible that, if such an idea had been suggested, his behavior during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. So he's like, okay, I need to totally ignore Elizabeth because I do not want her, or anybody, I guess, to think that I actually like her. So he's like, if they think that, I need to do something to make them think the opposite. So he's going to ignore her. Steady to his purpose of ignoring her, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book and would not even look at her. On Sunday, after morning service, the separation, so agreeable to almost all, took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased, at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane. And when they parted, they were assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see her, either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former. Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest spirits. So, like, thank goodness we are leaving. And Miss Bingley was like, heck yeah, get out of here, you know. Anyway, I mean, they were nice to each other, but still. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. But their father, though very laconic in his expressions of pleasure, was really glad to see them. He had felt their importance in the family circle. The evening conversations, when they were all assembled, had lost much of its animation and almost all its sense by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. He's like, yeah. He's like, you girls, y'all were gone and everything was wild. Well, not wild, but that it was nonsensical. Like, it was nonsense here. They found Mary, as usual, deep in study of thorough base and human nature, and had some new extracts to admire and some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle. A private had been flogged, and it had actually been hinted that Colonel Forster was going to be married. The end.